Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we are going to be continuing to talk about fantasy football and previewing the teams for this offseason, and we are now moving to the Los Angeles Chargers. So I've done every team listed alphabetically before Los Angeles, so if you want to check that out, check out my channel and I have those teams previewed. But I'm going through every single position to help you win a fantasy football title this year. That's my goal for this season, is to make videos and to help you out with that. So if you're interested, please check out my channel, like, comment, and subscribe. So first of all, if you know the name of the song that I started out with on this video, please let me know in the comments section. And if you do, and you guess it right, then I will answer one of your fantasy football questions on the channel and give you a shout out for your support. So take advantage of that, because people have not been doing that on my videos. So if you go back and you look at videos that I've asked for song requests, you'll see that there's still up for grabs on the table for you to answer questions for. So take advantage of that while you can. Also, if you're interested in other content on my channel, I make a wide variety of videos. I talk about fantasy football. I'm going to talk about some NBA stuff as we approach the off season. Also, I make song covers. I just made a Def Leppard cover recently, but I also do some other covers like John Mayer, Oasis, other things like that. So check out my channel if you're interested in that. I also do reactions to songs as well, like Tool, other things. So if you're interested in all that kind of stuff, or just one or two of them, then check it out. I talk about a wide variety of stuff here. So let's move to the Los Angeles Chargers. And a lot of interesting players here that I want to talk about on this team, but first let's go through their schedule. And the key takeaways with the Los Angeles Chargers schedule is that there's two ideal times to buy low to take advantage of this team. One is after week 1. They have a great matchup schedule from week 2 to 4. Gets a little more difficult there in the middle, but then an excellent time to buy low on them again is at week 11, because their finishing stretch to the season is excellent. So let's go through it. First game of the season, they start off at the Washington football team. They project to be one of the best defenses in the NFL. So what it looks like is that these players could start off poorly in week 1, but then they've got some good matchups the next 3 weeks. They play the Dallas Cowboys in week 2. They go to Kansas City. That expects to be a shootout. And then they play the Las Vegas Raiders, which is a team I just talked about that also does not have a good defense. So those are pretty good matchups there from week 2 to 4. And Justin Herbert, showing that he's a competent quarterback, I expect him to take advantage of those defenses. Then if things get a little more difficult, they play the Cleveland Browns. They project to be a little better. Baltimore Ravens week 6. Bye week 8, they got New England. Remember, they had a couple players opt out last year, so their defense projects to be improved as long as they still have Stephon Gilmore. And then they have other tough defenses as well, like Minnesota and Pittsburgh, within those next 3 weeks. So, but after Pittsburgh week 11, things get a lot easier for them. So they go to Denver, which is a team that it's historically been a good defense, but remember, the last time they went to Denver, they put up 31 points. Or excuse me, they put up 30 points. So they can definitely have shown that that Herbert can score at Denver. And then they go to Cincinnati, a team that has been running the 4-3 sieve for the past 10 years, it seems. Or the Vontaze Burfict targeting. I don't know. I'm from Cincinnati, and I understand these things about this team. It's just sad. And then they play the New York Giants, and then they play the Kansas City Chiefs again. And then right around the time of the playoffs, you've got Houston and Denver for those last 2 weeks. And if you're in a format where you play week 18, you're getting the Las Vegas Raiders. So that closing stretch from week 12 to week 18, you've got Denver, Cincinnati, New York, Kansas City, Houston, Denver, Las Vegas. Those are some of the worst defenses in that collection group, and their other ones are mid-tier at best. So it's a great stretch to end the season. So ideal time is to try to buy them low around week 10 and 11. Take advantage of that closing stretch to really take advantage of these players. So speaking of these players, we move now to the quarterback position. And we will start with Justin Herbert. Of note, they did get a new coach. I expect that their new coach is going to open up more of the playbook for Justin Herbert, so this will significantly help the offense. But we talk about Herbert specifically. Herbert played well last year. We look at his stats from a year ago. He was the number 9 quarterback in fantasy football. So he did pretty well, and he's a guy that I'm still very high on this season because you can get him for a pretty good value in the draft, I believe. He put up 384 points, which was within 100 points of Aaron Rodgers. Go back to my Patrick Mahomes. Aaron Rodgers was the number 1 quarterback last year, but if you go back to my video where I talk about Patrick Mahomes, I talk about stratification of quarterback points and that the top 5 are typically, they're outliers, but then from 6 to 18, which is the realm that you're picking up late tier draft picks to guys you could pick up on waivers, they're relatively about the same. And Herbert is one of the guys that is in that category with the upside of potentially leapfrogging into that top 5 tier quarterbacks. I don't think he's going to be top 5 this year, but he's got the talent to eventually get there. He threw for 336 yards last year. He had 31 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, a little high, but honestly it wasn't anything too crazy compared to some of the other quarterbacks above him. But then he also had 5 rushing touchdowns and 234 yards. So he has the ability to run the ball as well. And can give you some productivity there. So Herbert has potential, especially as he grows as an NFL quarterback, to just continue to improve on those numbers. And they just drafted Rashawn Slater to help with that offensive line. So all that being said, I really like Justin Herbert. They're also getting Austin Ekeler back for the full season. I'm going to talk about him in a little bit. So he's a guy that is going to be available mid to late draft and is going to be a good quarterback that you can pick up to get some of those skill position players early on, but then take a guy like Justin Herbert later on. Could be very beneficial for you. So we now move to the running back position, and I just mentioned Austin Ekeler, and I'm going to talk about him again. So Austin Ekeler is a guy I was very high on last year because of his PPR potential, his speed, and his involvement in the offense. So he kind of is a poor man's version of Christian McCaffrey to a degree in this offensive system, the way he was utilized with the team in the past, because he has a large role as a receiving running back, but he also is surprisingly effective at running the ball for efficiency for somebody that's as small as he is. I believe he's only about 5'7". Or no, he's 5'10". He looks like he's a lot smaller than that on the field, to be honest. But he's known for his speed. He did have a pretty significant hamstring strain last year that limited his availability. But when he has involvement in this offense, and he really it can be a strong focal point for you. There were, particularly a game against Buffalo, he had 16 targets and 11 receptions. He also had another 11 reception game. He had a 9 reception game. He has multiple games in which he's getting at least 15 carries. So he has involvement as both a pass down running back and a receiving and an early down running back as well. The only thing with this team is that I think that his numbers were a little bit skewed last year because he did have a pretty significant injury early on. So I think later on in the season when they were out of the playoffs, they're not necessarily trying to overwork him. So he didn't necessarily have some stellar games. He was a little bit unpredictable at times, but the ceiling of this guy is a top 5 tier running back performer. And I think that he's a guy that you can get him late first, early second, maybe late second, depending on how far he slips. And I think he has excellent value for you, especially in PPR leagues. I really like Austin Ekeler. Other guys that they have in the backfield of note. So the Justin Jackson is a guy that we thought would have more of an opportunity in the system, but he kind of dealt with some injuries as well and only played 9 games. He did average 4.6 yards a carry, so he was the most productive running back of the 3 that followed on Austin Ekeler in the depth chart, but Justin Jackson had a little bit difficult of a time getting involved. So if you go with any handcuff, assuming that they're all healthy, I would probably take Justin Jackson as the running back in this backfield. But still, I think that if Austin Ekeler were to get injured for some reason, I think this becomes a little bit more of a committee in terms of how they're going to utilize these running backs. Another guy they've got is Joshua Kelley. Josh Kelley, he was expected to kind of step into that role and be an effective handcuff, a guy that formerly was a handcuff to really seize the opportunity and take over this backfield. It didn't necessarily happen that way, and he actually was outperformed by Kalen Ballage, who's no longer on the team. But Joshua Kelley played the most games of these running backs, but it had the fewest yards per carry. He had 2 touchdowns. He had 111 attempts, but only 354 yards. And then on top of that, he only had 23 receptions. So he didn't necessarily stand out. So I think that, this is, I think, an extreme case of a handcuff at best, if to maybe stash. But maybe I'm really not looking at him as a guy that I would be drafting at all as a handcuff. I think that Justin Jackson, I would definitely consider that, especially if you own Austin Ekeler, but not really as much interested in Joshua Kelley just based on what I saw last year. Another guy that they picked up in the draft that has some interest to me is Larry Rountree, the third out of Missouri. He was a 6th-round draft pick. Again, not really a guy I'm looking at to draft, but if Austin Ekeler has health issues again and there's another situation where none of these running backs are really stepping up at all, Rountree might be the guy to take advantage of that opportunity and to seize that void that I talked about in a lot of my videos before if you want to check those out. So I'm going to keep an eye on him as well, but this time just merely a waiver wire guy to monitor from time to time. We now move to the wide receiver position. So, and some interesting trends that happen with these receivers under Justin Herbert that haven't really been the case with Philip Rivers in the past. So I'm going to start with Keenan Allen, the number 1 receiver on the depth chart. So Keenan Allen with Philip Rivers is a guy that I generally avoided because he is the definition of inconsistent. He has he'll have stretches of these games too where he'll just explode as this top 5 caliber receiver in terms of his receptions, his touchdowns, his yards. He just gives you the whole package. But then there's other stretches of games, and they could just be lengthy, 4 to 8 games at a time of him just 2 catches, 10 yards, 3 catches, 20 yards, stuff like that. So a guy I generally would try to avoid with Philip Rivers, but with Justin Herbert, he really kind of broke that mold. He had, the first 2 games, Justin Herbert was still getting settled in, so kind of throw those aside. But the next 14 games that he played, he had a touchdown in all but 4 games. So that's pretty consistent there. And then you look at his targets, in only 3 of those games, he didn't get at least 10 targets. So they didn't always necessarily yield to receptions, but you assume Justin Herbert, now that he's entering his 2nd year, he's going to have more familiarity with the NFL system. More of those targets will translate into receptions. And if he's a guy that's consistently getting 10-plus targets, and he had 2 games where he had 19 targets, then this guy is the definition of a focal point of an offense and a guy that you definitely want to consider taking. I'm going to be interested to see where he falls on draft boards, but if he's a guy that falls into the 3rd or 4th round, he could be excellent value for you for a team that's generally flying under the radar. If you have a tandem of Herbert and Keenan Allen, that could be an excellent stack for you. So I'm a little more high on Keenan Allen than I have been in the past. Other guys of note, so Mike Williams, he's another guy that has been very inconsistent throughout his career. And he showed a little bit of improvement with Herbert, but still I'm a little uncertain of him. So he had 85 targets, and 756 yards, which are both second on the. So his yards was second on the team. His targets was third to Hunter Henry. He's not on the team anymore. But he had 5 touchdowns out of that, but he only had 48 receptions. So he remains to be a receiver that relies heavily on the long ball production, and because of that, he gives you inconsistent games. So all that being said, I'm not very high on receivers like that because they have such variation in the performances that they can give you from game to game. Not as much interested in Mike Williams, but he does have potential to improve, even though he hasn't necessarily shown that yet. Other guys, Jalen Guyton was the number 4 receiver on this team in terms of his targets and yards, but that he was another guy that is wildly unproductive, and he actually started out the season very well, but did not play as effectively down the stretch by far. So Jalen Guyton, I'm not necessarily as interested in. And I think a lot of this is because a lot of the receptions will go to guys like Austin Ekeler instead of some of these receivers in the middle. Tyron Johnson is another guy like that, another young receiver who only had 20 receptions last year. So he's got some familiarity with the system, but he's got to show some more improvement as well. But a receiver that I am mildly interested in is Josh Palmer, a 3rd-round draft pick out of Tennessee. So, again, of guys that have potential to fill a void in this Chargers offense and become a consistent receiver threat, Palmer could be a guy to look out for. So, what I like about the scouting report of him is that he's not necessarily known as a speed receiver, but he's known as a more polished guy that can be a possession receiver. He's 6'1", 210, so he's a little bit bigger than the average receiver. His knock on him is that he doesn't necessarily have that breakaway speed, but he is a guy that you can rely upon in possessions to move the chains for you. And this is exactly what this team needs because they have a lot of guys that have speed and can break away, but they need some more guys that they can just rely upon for possession. And maybe Josh Palmer could be a guy to take advantage of that for a pretty murky wide receiver core after Mike Williams. And Mike Williams is still, the jury's kind of out on him and what he'll be in the NFL as well. So Josh Palmer has a lot of opportunity to potentially step into the system and be a productive fantasy player. Maybe worth considering late in drafts if you're in very deep leagues. Now we move to the tight end position. So their tight end before was Hunter Henry. He went to New England. I'm high on him in New England, but I'm going to save that for a later video. But they did pick up Jared Cook from the New Orleans Saints. So Jared Cook is the definition of a name that has had productive years in the past, but he's a guy that you want to avoid in fantasy football this year. Over the past couple years, and especially last year, he's very touchdown dependent. If he's not getting a receiving touchdown, he's generally not giving you very much at all in terms of yards. And he's moving from the New Orleans Saints, which was a team that is a generally more efficient offense. Granted, hasn't been the same last year because of Drew Brees' injuries and things like that. But Jared Cook, anyway, is past his prime. I like some of the other receiving options on this team better. Not as big a fan of Jared Cook, and I would recommend avoiding him because, if anything, he's going to get drafted way higher than the production he's actually going to give you. Other guys that they have, Donald Parham Jr. is a backup tight end who actually was relatively productive around the goal line. He had 3 touchdowns, but he also only had 10 receptions. So what I'm getting at with all that is that this guy is incredibly dependent on red zone production, and personally I just avoid tight ends like that because it's just too much of a gamble to rely on them game to game. And then they also have another tight end that they drafted in the NFL draft this year. His name is Trey McKitty out of Georgia. It'd be interesting to see what becomes of him, but he does have potential to step up into a void to be filled. So he has mild interest, but I don't think that he's going to be high enough on draft boards to consider him at all. Maybe monitor him on waivers, especially if you're going to be going with the tight end stream route. Defense, special teams. So this defense has a lot of room for improvement for this season. They were a not necessarily a great defense last year, but they also had Joey Bosa injured. They do they're going to be getting him back. They do have some other talented players as well, so there is some room for improvement. The thing that scares me is that they have some good offenses in this league, like Kansas City, Las Vegas at times. So you have to keep an eye out for that. But I expect them to be a better defense than where they're probably going to go in draft boards, and thus they could be a good candidate for you to pick up in that last round of the draft. As I always advocate, you take the defense in the second to last round, and you take the kicker in the last round because those are the most expendable positions that you can stream, and it's not going to affect you week by week. And most of the time you pick up defenses and kickers anyway that are some of the best ones you get are off waivers. Case in point, last year, one of the best defenses in the league, two of the best defenses in the league that you almost universally got off waivers were the Miami Dolphins and the Washington football team. For kickers, Younghoe Koo was almost universally undrafted, but became the best kicker in fantasy football last year. So, that being said, do not take these positions other than the last and the second to last round. And Chargers could be a good defense for you to target in that second to last round. So I transition to the kicker now, and their kicker is Michael Badgley. He has some good games at times, but he's a player that is inconsistent as well. So he's probably going to be available in that second to last round. There could be a situation where they struggle to score in the red zone, probably because they have a very small running back that they plan to give the ball to a lot. But if they struggle scoring, Michael Badgley could be a good last-round kicker for you to take. Not super high on him compared to other kickers that you can get around there, but he's definitely worth monitoring depending on how the offense develops for this team. So that's all I got on the Chargers. I'm going to talk about the other Los Angeles team next, and continue to talk about fantasy football this summer, so stay tuned if you want to check out more content. All right, I'll see you guys later. Bye.